Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that subscribe button, hit like, all of that good stuff. So, a quick prediction for Eleider Alvarez versus Joe Smith Jr. Of course, this is a light heavyweight bout. Goes down on the 22nd of August at the Bubble in the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. I think this is an excellent fight, I have to say. A battle between two top 10 light heavyweights with contrasting styles. Both guys have been involved in their fair share of exciting fights, so I think these guys are going to put on a show. I think this one's going to be an interesting fight. Anyway, let's get to the tail of the tape. Let's briefly run through the tail of the tape. We shall start with Eleider Alvarez. He has a record of 25 wins, 1 defeat, 0 draws. 13 of those 25 wins coming by way of knockout. Joe Smith Jr. has a record of 25 wins, 3 defeats, 0 draws. 20 of those 25 wins coming by way of knockout. Eleider Alvarez is listed as 6 foot with a 76-inch reach, whereas Joe Smith Jr. is listed as 6 foot with a 73-inch reach. So both guys are the same height, but Eleider Alvarez is longer. He does have a 3-inch reach advantage, and in my opinion, given the style clash, that could be significant in this fight, but we'll get onto that a bit later. Both of these guys are orthodox fighters. In terms of the ages, Eleider Alvarez is 36 years old, whereas Joe Smith Jr. is 30 years old. I actually thought Joe Smith Jr. was older than that. Seems like he's been around a long time actually, but he's only 30 years old, so Joe Smith Jr. does actually have youth on his side. Maybe he's got more in the tank. I'll actually touch on that a bit later, but yeah, a fairly evenly matched fight, in my opinion. But anyway, let's get on to the style clash. Who needs to do what to win? We shall start with Eleider Alvarez. In my opinion, I think the game plan for Eleider Alvarez is quite straightforward. We've seen Joe Smith Jr. come unstuck at the higher level in the light heavyweight division. He got outboxed by Dimitri Bivol. He really couldn't contain Bivol's movement. He could never really cut the ring off that effectively. And he also lost to Sullivan Barrera in a fight where he was kept behind the jab. Barrera really managed the distance quite well, and he really kind of just outboxed Joe Smith Jr. behind that jab. He didn't do it with the same level of movement as Bivol did, but he basically tamed the pressure fighter with a hard jab, and I think that's the route Eleider Alvarez needs to go down. I don't think he's got the legs to replicate what Bivol did, but the key here is obviously maintaining distance against a mid-range, up-close hooker like Joe Smith Jr. Joe Smith Jr. for me not really effective on the outside. His jab not really to write home about, and his straight right, his long straight right, isn't the best either. Joe Smith Jr. is very good at delivering mid-range punches and short-range punches, but on the outside, I actually think he's quite ineffective. So for me, the key for Eleider Alvarez is obviously maintaining that range. You know, he needs to get that jab going. Eleider Alvarez does actually have a very good jab. He was a well-schooled amateur, and that comes through in his fighting style. Eleider Alvarez is one of those guys who doesn't set the world alight, but he does the basics extremely well. And if he sticks to those basics, you know, the jab, the long punches, taking a step back, maintaining range, if he does that, I think he's going to be a hard style matchup for Joe Smith Jr. to overcome. And also, it's not just the fact that Eleider Alvarez can pop that jab consistently. That jab actually has a bit of mustard behind it. It's quite a powerful jab at times. And again, a pressure fighter like Joe Smith Jr. needs to be put in his place. You can't really prod and probe and try to basically steal a decision. You actually have to be a bit authoritative within that jab. We saw that in the Sullivan Barrera fight and even the Bivol fight. I know Bivol used more movement, but he was walking Joe Smith onto some big shots, as was Barrera, and that certainly dented Joe Smith's confidence to come forwards. You know, if you don't give Joe Smith anything to worry about, he's going to keep on marauding forwards, and he's going to keep on looking for those big power shots. And if he does get close, he's extremely dangerous. I've got no doubt in my mind whatsoever that Joe Smith Jr. has the power to hurt Eleider Alvarez. I think Joe Smith, as limited as he is, his power is quite real, and I certainly believe he can hurt anybody in the light heavyweight division. So for me, Eleider Alvarez, it's all about, you know, managing that distance and taking away the opportunity for Joe Smith to land those big looping hooks and that overhand right. Also with Joe Smith Jr., obviously Alvarez needs to manage the distance, and that's the main task at hand. But I think it would pay Eleider Alvarez to also work the body of Joe Smith Jr., once again to try and domesticate that pressure fighter, take the stuffing out of him, take the air out of him, reduce his stamina so that pressure isn't quite as intense. Eleider Alvarez can work the body. We saw that in that first Sergey Kovalev fight, and even the second fight where he got completely outboxed. I felt the one area where he was still having some success was that body, but he didn't stick with it. In this fight, when the opportunity presents itself, try to work that body, you know. Obviously only when it's safe to do so, but maybe in the clinch, maybe if you get a hand free, start working the body with that free hand, hooks to the body, uppercuts through the middle, you know, things like this just to really take the stuffing out of Joe Smith Jr. Also that jab, you know, don't just jab the head, change levels with it, you know, jab the head, come down to the body, jab the body. Stick that jab in Joe Smith's chest. When you continuously throw a hard jab to someone's chest, it does reduce their stamina, and it's very effective. A lot of fighters don't do it enough. There's not many fighters out there who have mastered the jab to the body these days, but I think that's an area where Alvarez again could have success, you know, in slowing down Joe Smith Jr. So for me, Eleider Alvarez needs to fall back on what he knows best, you know, the fundamentals of boxing, keeping it long, keeping range, maintaining distance, and basically domesticating the pressure fighter in Joe Smith Jr. You know, that's what he needs to do. It's quite simple, really. I think everyone knows how to fight Joe Smith Jr. at this stage, and I'm sure Eleider Alvarez is obviously aware of that. As for Joe Smith Jr., again, he can only really fight one way, can't he? Coming forwards, throwing big shots. But, you know, ultimately Joe Smith just needs to make it a rough and tough fight. He needs to close the distance in this fight and work Eleider Alvarez up close so he can land those big shots. Quicken up those feet, actually use a jab to get on the inside, change levels with your head, you know, come in low, try to slip the jab, step off to the side and start working, you know. Joe Smith just needs to close distance in this fight, and every single time Joe Smith has Eleider Alvarez up close, he needs to work. He needs to hit that body, hit that head. Even if everything's not getting through, he just needs to work and throw those heavy-handed shots. Because even when those shots aren't landing, even if they're landing on elbows and shoulders, etc., they still actually hurt after a while, and they can really wear your man out. So, listen, every time Joe Smith has Eleider Alvarez up close, he needs to work. He has to work. He can't afford to let these moments slip. He really can't. Otherwise, he could see the fight really slipping away from himself. And, you know, the reason Joe Smith Jr. really has to work in these moments is the fact that one thing about Eleider Alvarez, in my opinion, he actually doesn't have the highest work rate in the world. You know, not that it's terrible or anything like that, but there are rounds where he throws very few punches, and these are the sort of rounds where you could nick based on activity. Even if some of the work you're doing isn't exactly clear, maybe it wins you the round on the judge's card. You know, just based on activity, and you're the one pushing the fight and actually being aggressive. So, yeah, I'm sure in this fight there are going to be rounds where Eleider Alvarez is actually quite conservative. In those moments, push him. Make him work hard. Because I don't think Eleider particularly likes to work that hard, to be honest. I think he's one of these guys who kind of likes to fight at his own pace. He's not one of those guys who wants to try and war with you, outwork you and win a dogfight. I know he kind of did that against Kovalev, you know, those kind of trading, but for the most part, Alvarez is a very conservative boxer behind those straight punches, and his work rate isn't always the best. Go back and watch his last fight with Michael Seals. Now, I know he scored a great knockout, and that's what people are going to remember. But in a lot of those rounds, he really wasn't looking that good, to be honest. Throwing very few punches, you know, not really doing all that much. And again, if Alvarez comes in this fight like that, then he could easily be outworked by Joe Smith Jr. Even if Joe Smith isn't doing the most quality work, maybe judges score it for him. So, yeah, work rate for Eleider Alvarez could be a key for Joe Smith Jr. If it's low, then potentially I could see a scenario where he actually outworks Eleider Alvarez. Who knows, maybe even wins it on points. You never know. But, yeah, I was a bit concerned, actually, with that last performance from Eleider Alvarez. To me, he looked slow. He looked workmanlike. He looked lethargic. Maybe that was because the level of opponent really wasn't doing it for Alvarez. Maybe he wasn't motivated. That could be the case. Or maybe at 36 years old, he's on the slide. That could be true as well. I mean, the fight before that against Kovalev, the rematch, Alvarez was really out of sorts. He got completely outboxed. Maybe Alvarez really is on the slide, and if he's on the slide, this is going to be a very difficult assignment for Eleider Alvarez. I find this fight fascinating, I really do. I think it's a great style clash. I think this could gel for a really good fight. I could see, a knockdown or two. I could see either guy getting stopped in this fight, I really could. I could see a points verdict. I think it's one of those fights where a lot can happen. But I'm going to assume that Eleider Alvarez is on point in this fight. And for me, he outboxes Joe Smith Jr. in a pretty competitive fight, but a clear fight. I think he wins this fight by unanimous decision. So there we go. Eleider Alvarez by unanimous decision. But I've got to say, I really like this fight. I like the fact that the boxing schedule is now picking up. The PBC obviously recently announced a pretty good schedule. Top Rank have got this fight coming up, which is a really good fight. So the schedule is now starting to take shape. And I've got to say once again, I'm relieved to actually be talking about boxing again, predicting fights and things like that. This is what I really enjoy doing on this channel. I love prediction videos. So yeah, I'm kind of happy right now. So there we go. Really good fight between Joe Smith and Eleider Alvarez. But I've got Eleider Alvarez on points. Share your thoughts below. Who are you picking? Are you picking Eleider Alvarez based on his boxing ability? Or are you picking Joe Smith Jr. to come through with that raw power and aggression? I'm intrigued to hear what you guys think. Share your thoughts below. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. It's been your boy Delboy. Peace.